They say history is written by the victors, but this story? This story was written in blood, etched into the shores of 1,000 broken kingdoms by men who believed their destiny was to burn the world down. For 300 years, the very name of their people was a curse, a prayer whispered in desperate terror. The Northmen.
Can you believe there was a time, not so long ago, when the maps of Europe were quiet, when the greatest threat was a bad harvest or a petty land squabble, a brief, deceptive calm before the most violent storm humanity had ever witnessed erupted from the frozen, chaotic darkness of Scandinavia? Prepare yourself, because we are diving deep into the saga of the Viking Age, a time so brutal, so ambitious, and so utterly legendary that even today the echoes of their longships can still be heard scraping against the sand. The year is 793 AD. Picture it, Northern England. The heart of Christian devotion beat strongest on a tiny, wind-swept island called Lindisfarne, Holy Island. This was a sanctuary, a place where monks dedicated their lives to quiet contemplation, transcribing glorious manuscripts, and believing, truly believing, that the gates of hell were firmly sealed against them. They were the guardians of the past, the keepers of peace. They had wealth, not gold in the worldly sense, but spiritual treasures, elaborate silver relics, and enough fine materials to make their monastery shine like a beacon in the northern gloom. They thought their faith was their shield. They thought the vast, empty sea was their border. They were tragically, catastrophically wrong. The sea was not a border. It was the highway for the apocalypse. One moment, the sky was clear, the air filled only with the sound of gulls and morning prayers. The next, the world fractured into pure, unadulterated nightmare. It started with sails, strange, menacing shapes emerging from the dense sea fog, low to the water, moving with impossible speed. These were not the occasional friendly merchant ships. These vessels were long, lean, and utterly devoid of mercy. And then came the sound, the terrifying, rhythmic beat of oars, the guttural, alien shouting that signaled the end of everything the Western world held sacred. The men who poured onto the peaceful shores were not soldiers, not invaders seeking territory in the traditional sense. They were something far worse. They were predators seeking plunder and chaos, their eyes burning with a cold fury the locals could not even begin to comprehend, driven by gods whose names were synonymous with conflict and cunning. The chroniclers of the time, those few who survived the slaughter, described them as wolves, as heathens, as demons spat forth from the mouth of Satan himself. They carried axes, designed not for chopping wood, but for splitting skulls, and they wielded them with a terrifying, efficient joy. The screams that echoed across Lindisfarne that day were not just of pain, but a fundamental shock. How could this happen? Who were these godless savages who struck like lightning and vanished just as fast, leaving behind nothing but smoke, fire, and the stench of blood? This raid was not just a robbery. It was a psychological weapon, a declaration of war against civilization itself. It signaled to every coastal village, every wealthy monastery, and every royal court across Europe that safety was an illusion. The rules of engagement had changed permanently.
We are talking about farmers who became global explorers, navigating featureless oceans without maps, reaching lands no one even knew existed, from the freezing expanse of Greenland all the way to the sweltering heat of the Byzantine Empire. We will follow their longships as they transform from simple raiding vessels into instruments of massive geopolitical change. We will see them found Russia, conquer half of England, besiege Paris, and establish trade routes that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Middle East, connecting worlds that had never touched before. These were the ultimate chameleons, terrifying berserkers fueled by mushroom-induced madness one day, sophisticated traders and brilliant lawmakers the next, poets, explorers, and terrifying conquerors all rolled into one unstoppable package of Norse fury.
Get ready to witness the incredible, terrifying rise of Ragnar Lothbrok, the political machinations of Harald Fairhair, the globe-spanning empire of Knut the Great, and the final apocalyptic stand of Harald Hardrada.
This is the story of how the Vikings didn't just raid the world, they fundamentally rewrote it. This is the Sleepless Historian, and we are about to journey into the heart of the storm. Let the saga begin.
King Offa of Mercia, the most powerful ruler in Britain, received the reports, and they sounded like fantastical nightmares, tales whispered by madmen in the dark. How could men appear and disappear like ghosts, striking at the very heart of faith, only to vanish back into the endless, gray expanse of the ocean? The esteemed scholar Alcuin of York, writing from the safety of Charlemagne's court, penned letters filled with abject horror. He saw the attack as a divine judgment upon the sins of the English people, a scorching reminder that the fragile peace of the Age of Saints was over. The chroniclers, the keepers of history, could only reach for apocalyptic language, writing of dragons flying through the air and famine following the event. It was not a battle. It was an execution of civilization as they knew it. But these were not demons sent by God. They were men driven by ice, iron, and an unrelenting hunger for what they could not cultivate. Far to the north, the people who lived there, the Norsemen, the Danes, the Sverre, were facing an existential crisis far colder and more brutal than any theological dilemma. Their populations were booming. Their ancient tribal structures were buckling under ambitious chieftains, and the limited arable land hemmed them in like a prison of rock and snow. There was too much ambition for too little ground,
and the political scene was a cauldron of petty, violent kings looking to expand their influence. The only way out, the only avenue for upward mobility, for status, for glory, the highest currency in the Norse world, was through the sea.
And when those desperate eyes looked south, they saw not mighty, unified armies, but fat, complacent monasteries overflowing with gold chalices, illuminated manuscripts, and fine silks, unprotected, irresistible wealth, ripe for the taking. Lindisfarne was merely the weakest, juiciest fruit on the tree of Christian Europe, and they were ready to shake the entire orchard down. Their true weapon, the technological marvel that turned them from marginal fishermen into the scourge of continents, was the streamlined, terrifying long ship. This was the single most revolutionary piece of technology of the early Middle Ages, redefining naval power and strategic mobility overnight. Forget the sluggish, high-sided galleys of the Mediterranean. The Viking longship was the apex predator of the water, a masterpiece of shallow draft engineering that defied all prior naval logic. It was a serpent of the sea, capable of crossing hundreds of miles of terrifying open ocean, yet drawing only a few feet of water. This meant no coastal defenses were safe. They didn't need fortified harbors. They needed a beach, or even better, a river mouth. Imagine the shock. The English expected threats to come from the coast, but the Vikings used the very arteries of the land, the rivers, to penetrate deep into the interior, bypassing all conventional fortifications entirely. Their ships were constructed using the clinker-built method, overlapping planks, which made them incredibly light and flexible. They could be beached instantly, and, in a desperate move, could literally be carried over short portages, allowing them to leap from one river system to the next, appearing where no rational military force could ever anticipate them. This was not warfare. It was surgical terror, executed with impossible speed. A typical raid could see the longships appear like shadows at dawn. The raiders strike with brutal efficiency, seizing all movable wealth and captives, and then vanish back into the anonymity of the sea by noon, leaving only smoke, silence, and trauma in their wake. No organized, slow-moving Anglo-Saxon defense could possibly respond to this kind of lightning blitzkrieg. Lindisfarne was the opening bell, and the world was too stunned to realize the fight had already begun. The taste of easy gold and the intoxicating thrill of victory proved immediately addictive. The years immediately following 793 AD saw the attacks escalate with horrifying predictability, proving that the Norse were learning and adapting faster than their victims. This established the devastating pattern. They were attacking the soft underbelly of civilization, the places dedicated to prayer, not war. They were strategically crippling the record keepers, the historians, and the spiritual leaders, ensuring the psychological damage was absolute and long-lasting. The psychological impact was their most potent weapon. If Iona could fall, if Lindisfarne could be defiled, then no place was truly safe. This fear paralyzed the fragmented kingdoms of Britain, forcing them to divert resources, to rebuild coastal defenses, and eventually to pay the Danes, the dreaded Danegeld, the very gold that financed future, larger invasions. Lindisfarne was not a warning shot. It was the total annihilation of the belief in sanctuary. The men of the north, those pale phantoms the Franks called Normanni, had tasted the blood of the righteous and found it utterly intoxicating. The silence that followed that 793 atrocity was more terrifying than the screams themselves, because everyone knew the storm was not over. It was merely reloading its terrible fury. The chroniclers of the age, usually concerned only with royal births and minor border skirmishes, now began to write with a shaking hand, their parchment stained with fear. They struggled to categorize this enemy, resorting to biblical language. They were heathen dogs, wolves from the sea, or the very wrath of God itself, sent to punish a sinful Europe. They couldn't rationalize them, so they demonized them. But rationalization was precisely what was needed. How could they strike so fast, vanish so completely? The answer, the very engine of the Viking Age, was a technological terror forged from pine and iron. The longship. It was not merely a boat. It was the ultimate instrument of surprise attack, a low-slung predator that could navigate the deepest ocean swells, and yet, moments later, sailed directly up a 4-inch deep river stream. The Christian kingdoms had built massive, deep-keeled trading vessels, slow and predictable. The Vikings built rapiers. Their ships required only a handful of men to beach, allowing 30 or 50 warriors to burst onto a shore and vanish back into the mist before any local militia could even sound the alarm. This was hit and run elevated to an art form, a terrifying dance of aquatic efficiency that the sleepy Anglo-Saxons could not comprehend. The shallow draft meant safety was meaningless. No inland monastery, no wealthy riverside farm was truly protected by distance. The sea had ceased to be a barrier and had become, instead, a superhighway leading straight to the unprotected treasure chests of the early medieval world. The era of coastal security was over, buried beneath the waves. The ink was barely dry on the Pope's terrified letters about the Lindisfarne disaster when the next wave hit, a tidal wave of blood that proved this was a strategy, not an accident. The very next year, 794 AD, the monks of Jarrow, home of the Venerable Bede, a site of unparalleled scholarly wealth, watched as their library burned and their treasures were ripped away, only to find the sea monsters suffered their first minor setback. In 795 AD, the raiders struck Ireland for the first time, hitting the island of Recru, opening up a new, agonizing front in the conflict. Ireland, a land rich in isolated, undefended ecclesiastical settlements, became a magnet for every desperate warrior seeking fame and fortune. They sailed up the Shannon, the Liffey, and the Slaney, charting the very arteries of the Emerald Isle. The surviving monks were forced to flee, seeking refuge inland, desperately trying to protect the Book of Kells, that shining jewel of the insular art, proving that culture itself had to go on the run to survive the onslaught of the Norsemen. The spiritual geography of the West was being violently rearranged by men whose only gods demanded gold and glory. While the British Isles were being pulverized, the colossal Frankish Empire, the domain of Charlemagne, the greatest king in the West, was watching in horror. Charlemagne was a land-based titan, focused on continental conquest, but suddenly his northern flank, the wealthy coast of Frisia and Saxony, was exposed to an enemy he couldn't even meet in a pitched battle. The terror was psychological as much as physical. These Norsemen were not like the Saxons or the Avars he had conquered. They were ghosts who struck from the horizon and vanished back into the fog. If they could attack a remote island monastery, they could certainly land on the Frisian coast and burn his mighty cities. Charlemagne's response was immediate, desperate, and ultimately insufficient against this new, fluid threat. He ordered the construction of coastal fortifications and deployed garrisons at every river mouth, especially along the Scheldt and the Elbe, trying to put a lock on a keyhole that kept moving. He even moved his own royal court further inland, a symbolic retreat that demonstrated the absolute failure of his vast army to protect the coast. He commissioned a fleet, a desperate attempt to fight fire with fire, but his deep-keeled Frankish vessels were no match for the speed and agility of the dreaded longships. For the Vikings, these raids, this relentless strandhog or beach striking, were not just about gold. They were about glory. Every successful return trip cemented the reputation of the Jarl, the chieftain who had led the voyage, increasing his fame and attracting more young, desperate warriors eager to prove their worth in battle. They were sailing toward a concept of personal immortality, a promise that their names would be remembered in the sagas, whether they died in the cold fjords or with an axe in their hands on some foreign shore. This thirst for glory, combined with the ruthless efficiency of their longships, turned the North Sea into a highway of horror, a liquid motorway leading straight to the heart of Christian Europe. The initial decade was a reconnaissance mission written in fire and blood. They learned the weakness of the kingdoms, they memorized the coastal towns, and they quickly understood that the Christian lords were slow to react and terrible at coordinating their defenses. They had proven the model was sustainable, profitable, and almost entirely risk-free. But the truly horrifying part of the saga was yet to come. Up until this point, the attacks had been quick, seasonal raids, hit, grab, and sail home before winter ice set in. Soon, the Norsemen would realize that if they stayed through the cold, if they fortified themselves on foreign soil, they could control entire regions, not just plunder them. The era of the summer raider was about to end, replaced by the age of the Viking warlord, the great armies, and the permanent settlement that would change the map forever. The longships were sailing not just for loot, but for dominion. Lindisfarne was merely the thunderclap. The storm that followed was the complete restructuring of the known world. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a cold, grinding reality. The Vikings were not going away. They were learning, adapting, and most terrifyingly, escalating their ambition beyond mere silver. The raids intensified immediately, stretching their blood-soaked tendrils down the coasts of Ireland, where they established the first true Norse settlements, the Longforts, Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, fortified harbors that were part military base, part pirate marketplace. They were sinking their roots deep into the soft, unprotected heart of the West. The Vikings sailed up the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhine, turning the lifeblood rivers of the Frankish heartland into their personal highways of destruction. They didn't just raid, they laid siege to major cities, demanding staggering ransoms, known across the continent as the Danegeld. The Danegeld was the ultimate symbol of royal failure and national humiliation. Kings and bishops, desperate to avoid the torching of their cities, scraped together mountains of silver, counted in bracelets, ingots, and coins, and handed it over to the very men who promised to return next year for a bigger payout. It was a protection racket on a continental scale, an industrialized plunder operation that bankrupted kingdoms.
Imagine the scene, the Viking ships anchored in full sight of Paris, while the terrified population watched wagon loads of their national wealth directly into the hands of their tormentors. This systematic extraction of wealth fueled the Norse war machine, allowing them to fund larger fleets and draw more warriors from the freezing north.
The true strategic shift, however, came with the terrifying concept of the wintering over. For decades, the attacks were seasonal, swift, terrifying bursts of summer fury followed by a retreat back to the fjords. But in the mid-9th century, the longships stopped going home. They established massive, permanent fortified encampments on captured islands or strategic riverbends, turning beachheads into bases of operation. These were not temporary shelters. They were military cities, permanent staging grounds for the conquest yet to come. The land itself was being occupied, piece by horrifying piece. This escalation culminated in 865 AD, a date that should be etched in fire on the calendar of history. The decentralized, opportunistic terror suddenly coalesced into a single, unified, monstrous force. The raids were over. The invasion had begun. History records its name with dread. The Mycel Heathen Heir, the Great Heathen Army. This was not a band of local brigands. This was a coalition of powerful Norse warlords, a unified striking force of unimaginable size and ambition, arriving in East Anglia with a purpose far beyond mere looting. They came for dominion, and they came for blood. The scale of this army was staggering, unlike anything the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had ever conceived. It traveled not just by sea, but quickly seized horses from the local populace,
transforming into a lightning-fast cavalry unit that moved with terrifying speed across the divided, soft landscape of England.
The four rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, were totally unprepared for a coordinated, sustained military attack of this magnitude. Their petty, internal squabbles, the endless jostling for local supremacy, suddenly seemed pathetically irrelevant in the face of this existential threat. The great heathen army struck Northumbria first, sensing the weakness born of a vicious civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, Osbert and Aella. The Vikings didn't just engage in skirmishes, they surgically dismantled the kingdom by exploiting its political suicide. With Northumbria neutralized and transformed into a Danish satellite, the army pivoted, turning its sights on the kingdom of Mercia. The longships were no longer just instruments of raid. They were the spearhead of a permanent territorial revolution that would challenge every king, every bishop, and every concept of order in Western Europe. That slender hope of resistance was a lie whispered into the wind, a desperate prayer from a world that had not yet grasped the true, horrifying scale of its torment. Lindisfarne was merely the opening tremor, a warning shot fired across the bow of the known world, a single sharp cough before the onset of a continent-wide plague of fire and steel. The years that followed 793 AD were not a period of quiet recovery or reorganization, but an accelerating, terrifying descent into utter chaos, a strategic masterpiece of destruction executed by the Norse masters of the sea.
The attacks intensified, shifting in both their frequency and their sheer, horrifying ambition. The target profile widened dramatically. The longships, once seen as terrifying specters that appeared and vanished with the unpredictable tide, were now staying. They were no longer focused solely on the soft, defenseless targets of the wealthy coastal monasteries and isolated farms. Now the targets were established cities, vital river mouths, and the very administrative heartlands of the weak, fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The legendary 40-ship fleet, the kind of overwhelming force that made court scribes faint with terror and bishops hide their relics, quickly became the new baseline, the minimum required for a successful season of terror and plunder. This was the dark dawn of the long forts, the crucial strategic shift that turned raiders into occupiers. The Vikings were learning the geography of the South, realizing the weakness inherent in rapid retreat. They stopped relying solely on the element of surprise and began to build, transforming temporary beachheads and captured estuaries into impenetrable launch pads for deeper inland penetration. They would fortify river islands, establishing winter camps, fortresses of pure, concentrated terror built from the very wreckages of the lands they had just conquered. These fortified bases, often in places like the Isle of Thanet or Sheppey, allowed them to maintain a permanent, year-round presence, turning southern England from a raiding destination into a war zone, eliminating the peaceful winter lull
that the Saxons had previously relied upon for breath. While Mercia eyed Northumbria with suspicion, refusing to share vital intelligence or military resources, and Kent looked nervously toward the burgeoning power of Wessex. The dragon ships were already sailing. While Mercia eyed Northumbria with suspicion, refusing to share vital intelligence or military resources, and Kent looked nervously toward the burgeoning power of Wessex. The dragon ships were already sailing unopposed up the Thames, up the Humber, and deep into the previously safe, sleepy agricultural heartlands. The interior was now vulnerable, the lifeblood of the kingdoms choked off by fleets sailing in darkness. Do not, for a single moment, mistake this terror for an island-specific plague or a localized problem for the English. This was a continental cancer, spreading with terrifying speed, a wave of destruction that threatened to wipe clean the slate of European civilization. Across the narrow English Channel, the Frankish Empire, the supposed successor to Roman stability, the great political and cultural project of Charlemagne himself, was fracturing under the unbearable weight of internal dynastic squabbles. The grandsons of the great emperor were too busy carving up Europe in endless, petty civil wars to notice that the true masters of the continent were arriving, uninvited and unstoppable, from the freezing northern seas. The Norsemen sailed with chilling impunity into the Seine, past the bewildered, ill-defended remnants of the Frankish armies, and reached the very stone walls of Paris itself. Imagine the scene, the jewel of the West, the seat of Christian learning and power, the city. Imagine the scene, the jewel of the West, the seat of Christian learning and power, the city that symbolized renewal, forced to watch helplessly from its ramparts as the bearded, screaming demons from the north set fire to every surrounding village and farm, demanding immediate satisfaction. This was, without question, the single worst military-economic decision in medieval history, a policy so disastrous it defies belief. Every single sack of precious silver handed over to the Jarls was not a deterrent or a peace offering, but a massive down payment on the next, larger, more ambitious invasion. The Vikings learned instantly and brutally. Raiding was profitable, but extorting the ruling class was infinitely, systematically more lucrative. They stopped relying on unpredictable plunder and started demanding specific, colossal amounts, turning piracy and theft into a highly organized, state-level criminal enterprise run by terror. The kings of the West were, in essence, literally financing the destruction of their own kingdoms, providing the Vikings with the capital needed for shipbuilding, recruitment, and provisioning their next grand adventure. By the middle of the 9th century, the era of small, seasonal hit-and-run raiding was definitively over, relegated to the history books. The fleets were coalescing into something far more sinister. The individual jarls and chieftains who had tasted the limitless riches of the South were now communicating across the seas, sharing vital intelligence, and realizing that if they combined their terrifying individual power, they could stop merely robbing the kingdoms and start taking them outright, conquering and settling the land forever.
The intelligence reports filtering into the broken courts of Wessex and Mercia were no longer merely worrying. They were genuinely apocalyptic. Whispers traveled along the muddy roads and through the ruined monastic centers. The entire north was emptying. Something vast, something unprecedented in European history was being prepared on the shores of Denmark and Norway. This was not merely another raiding party led by a minor chieftain. This was not a standard fleet of 100 ships. This was an organized, professional army. It was a force so immense, so utterly dedicated to the complete conquest and subjugation of England, that future historians would give it a title that echoed through the centuries like the clang of 1,000 war axes. Mickly Hare, the Great Army. The desperate plea for a single isolated resistance was about to be answered, not by salvation, but by an inescapable, earth-shattering tidal wave of Norse wrath. The desperate plea for a single isolated resistance was about to be answered, not by salvation, but by an inescapable, earth-shattering tidal wave of Norse wrath. The scattered resistance had failed. The Danegeld had only fattened the beast. The sleeping giant of Anglo-Saxon England was about to be devoured whole. And the year the terror arrived would change the map of Europe forever. The age of the opportunistic, seasonal Viking was dead. The age of the Viking conqueror was dawning, bringing with it a darkness unlike any the civilized world had ever conceived. The relentless hammer blow was finally ready to fall. The world was holding its breath, clinging to the fading memory of peace, but they didn't understand. Lindisfarne was not the climax. It was the chilling, throat-clearing introduction to a saga written in blood and fire. The hammer blow had been threatened, and now the Iron Age of piracy had begun its relentless, agonizing descent upon every civilized shore, proving that the shadows cast by the longships were far more expansive than anyone had dared to imagine. The initial terror, that paralyzing shock of the heathen men appearing from nowhere, quickly solidified into a dreadful, recurring reality. Monasteries, the light sources of the Dark Ages, were systematically extinguished along the British coast in a terrifying campaign of strategic defunding. Iona, the holy island off Scotland's west coast, a beacon of Celtic Christianity and a monumental storehouse of wealth and knowledge, fell just 2 years after Lindisfarne in 795 AD, its sacred relics scattered and its monks butchered. While England was still calculating the cost of the first wave, the longships turned west, slicing through the treacherous Irish Sea with uncanny skill. Ireland, a fragmented mosaic of petty kingdoms known as Tuatha, was ripe for the plucking. Its internal divisions and lack of unified coastal defenses made it a golden target, a weakness the Norse predators exploited with masterful, almost surgical precision, using their superior mobility to bypass local resistance entirely. The year 795 AD saw the first major strikes against Irish shores. Rathlin Island was devastated, followed rapidly by the rich coastal communities and rivermouth settlements, the gateways to internal wealth. These attacks were executed with a new level of professionalism, organized, rapid, and focused entirely on portable wealth, silver, slaves, and the incredible metalwork of the Irish artisans, which would soon be melted down and recast into Norse jewelry and weapons.
The long ships were the ultimate technology of terror. Shallow-drafted wonders capable of beaching rapidly or sailing 50 miles deep upriver, rendering all traditional coastal defenses utterly useless. They could vanish into the mist before any local levy could even muster, leaving behind only smoking ruins and the haunting, indelible echoes of screams. The very geography of the British Isles, with its numerous rivers and bays, seemed to welcome the invader.
But the defining moment of this early, frantic phase was the chilling realization that these men were not seasonal bandits who retreated when the autumn winds blew cold. They started building the dreaded Long Fort, fortified winter camps, signaling a fundamental, existential change in their intent. They were staying. They were digging in, establishing forward operating bases that would turn hit-and-run raids into systematic campaigns of annual extortion.
This transformation from ephemeral ghosts to entrenched invaders sent shivers down the spine of continental Europe, right into the court of the most powerful man alive, Charlemagne. The great Frankish emperor, the restorer of the Western Roman Empire, and the self-proclaimed defender of Christendom, watched with growing dread as the shadows lengthened across the northern frontiers of his vast realm.
Charlemagne understood that the sea, which had always been a natural barrier protecting the continental heartland, was now a broad, unobstructed highway for destruction, leading straight to the wealthy river cities. He immediately began investing heavily in coastal defenses, constructing watchtowers, garrisons, and organizing a proper navy to patrol the river mouths, particularly the Scheldt and the Seine, trying desperately to seal his borders.
Viking society was a brutal meritocracy fueled entirely by violence and reputation. A successful raid didn't just bring portable wealth, it brought glory, the highest currency in the Norse world. The young men who returned rich and famous were magnets for others, driving the next generation of ever larger, ever more ambitious expeditions across the churning, unforgiving sea. This positive feedback loop of destruction meant that every silver coin stolen from a monastery financed the forging of a new sword, the construction of a faster longship, and the recruitment of 50 more desperate, hardened warriors, hungry for the legendary easy wealth of the southern softlands. The economic engine of the Viking Age was pure European terror.
The early 800s saw the raids mature into massive annual campaigns. The attacks became more coordinated, targeting not just isolated monasteries, but emerging crucial trade centers like Dorestad in Frisia, which was sacked repeatedly, shaking the economic foundations of the Carolingian Empire to its core, and threatening the stability of the entire continent.
The world was learning the new, terrifying calculus of the Viking Age. The cost of defense always exceeded the profit of the raid, meaning the civilized world was perpetually running at a massive deficit of security, while the Norse coffers perpetually swelled. They were draining the lifeblood of Europe, one brutal, swift attack at a time, preparing for the colossal undertaking that would soon dwarf all early efforts. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deep, gnawing despair. People no longer prayed for safety. They prayed only that the shadows of the long ships would pass them by, that the judgment of the axe and the flame would fall on someone else this year. The true age of continuous existential warfare had arrived, and there was absolutely no hiding from the storm that was gathering strength far to the north.
The initial world-shattering shock of 793 AD did not dissipate. It solidified into an annual, agonizing dread. The sound of the spring thaw and the receding mists no longer brought relief, but the icy terror of the dragon-headed ships returning to claim their yearly tribute of blood and gold. Western Christendom quickly realized that Lindisfarne was not an isolated act of barbaric cruelty, but the opening salvo in a war that would span 3 centuries and redefine the continent itself. The Vikings had learned that the wealth of the monasteries was undefended, easily harvested, and endlessly replenished by the faithful. The coastal communities prayed not for safety, but for obscurity, hoping the raven banner would pass them by and let the flame fall on someone else this year. The true age of continuous existential warfare had arrived, and there was absolutely no hiding from the storm that was gathering strength far to the north. Their targets multiplied with terrifying precision, mapping the spiritual infrastructure of the British Isles like a military cartographer planning an invasion. They came back for Jarrow. They smashed the sacred community of Iona, not once, but repeatedly, shattering the heart of the Celtic Church in 802 and again in 806.
This was strategic de-civilization. The burning of libraries, the slaughter of the scholarly monks, was the systematic destruction of history and institutional memory. These were not just thieves, they were culture killers, ensuring that the lights of learning that had flickered bravely through the Dark Ages were finally, brutally extinguished. The fleets grew from 5 ships to 20, then 50, then fleets so vast they seemed to blot out the horizon itself. The sheer audacity of their enterprise became the fuel for the terrifying legends whispered in every village. They were not merely seeking silver anymore. They were testing the very limits of the defense capabilities of the established kingdoms. The raids transitioned from opportunistic piracy to organized, large-scale expeditions led by ambitious jarls and proto-kings seeking to carve out true realms of their own. They studied the tides, the river systems, and the weak points of the coastal defenses with the brutal efficiency of seasoned generals. And then came the true psychological weapon that broke the back of resistance. They stopped leaving. For decades, the local populace had clung to the hope that the terror was seasonal
that the winter frosts brought blessed safety. But in the 840s, a new, chilling realization dawned across England and Francia. The Northmen were wintering over. They found defensible estuaries, often on islands or river mouths like Thanet or Sheppey, and built massive fortified camps, known as long forts in the Irish tradition. This was the ultimate escalation. The enemy was no longer a ghost that vanished with the autumn winds. They were an established presence, entrenched deep within the kingdom's borders. These winter camps served as forward operating bases, allowing the Vikings to raid continuously without the exhausting journey back across the unforgiving North Sea. Imagine the sheer, bone-deep terror of knowing that the raiders were not distant seafarers, but your actual, immediate neighbors, waiting for the first sign of spring to begin the harvest of your life and labor. The response of the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, was disastrously fragmented. Unable to coordinate a unified military response, they resorted to the most humiliating and self-destructive defense mechanism ever conceived: Danegeld, the payment of the Danes' gold. This was the ultimate admission of failure, a desperate, shameful ransom paid to the invaders simply to convince them to temporarily lift the siege and sail away, promising falsely to never return. Every ounce of silver paid was a direct investment in the Viking war machine, guaranteeing that the following year's fleet would be larger, better equipped, and infinitely hungrier. It was a tax on weakness, a circular economic engine of destruction fueled by the very people it sought to destroy. The Vikings quickly learned that it was often easier and infinitely more profitable to threaten burning a city down and demand a vast treasure than to waste effort fighting for it, transforming the Northmen into protection racketeers on a massive international scale.
Meanwhile, across the treacherous Irish Sea, the story was even more brutal. Ireland, rich in decentralized monastic wealth and lacking any unified national army, was a treasure trove ripe for the taking. The Vikings established the first true, permanent settlements in Ireland, strategically seizing control of key harbors. They didn't just raid monasteries, they established fortified coastal towns, creating the very first urban centers in Ireland, fundamentally changing the country's demographic and political map forever.
The birth of Dublin, Dyflin to the Norse, was the ultimate declaration of intent. This was not a winter camp. It was a permanent, thriving hub of Viking power, trade, and slaving operations. From this base, they could control the trade routes, project power deep inland, and continuously export wealth back to Scandinavia or to their growing network of outposts. The Vikings had successfully transitioned from being seasonal pirates to established merchant warriors, seizing control of the crucial arteries of Western European commerce. For decades, the coastal monasteries and vulnerable villages had learned to fear the shadow of the longship, a phantom that vanished as quickly as it struck, taking gold and leaving only ash and dread. But what arrived in the year 865 AD was not a shadow, not a raid, and not a phantom looking for a quick score of silver. It was the night itself, come to stay, demanding every acre of English soil.
This was not a quick smash-and-grab operation for easy treasure. This was a calculated, industrialized, grinding war of extermination aimed directly at the heart of the 4 remaining Christian kingdoms of Britain, intending to rip their dominion out by the root. They called it the Mickle Here, the Great Army. But that title barely scratched the surface of the horror it represented. It was a continent of fury, organized and disciplined, a tidal wave of blood and iron that threatened to drown every scrap of Anglo-Saxon sovereignty.
Imagine 1,000 longships, not scattered like hungry wolves, but sailing in perfect, terrifying formation, blotting out the sun as they descended upon the shores of East Anglia, making landfall at a place called the Isle of Thanet. They did not land quietly. They surged onto the beaches like a geological event, establishing immediate, fortified camps that were less temporary barracks and more instant, terrifying cities of war. And at the head of this colossal force rode the sons of legend, demanding attention and, crucially, demanding vengeance. There was Halfdan Ragnarsson, cold, strategic, and utterly ruthless, already smelling the weak points in the Saxon defenses.
There was Ubba, the alleged berserker, a man whose sheer, monstrous presence alone was enough to curdle the blood of seasoned warriors, a living incarnation of the Nordic war god, Tyr. But the true terror, the cold, calculating mind behind the madness, was the man who had to be carried among them like a skeletal specter, laid out on a shield or litter. Ivar the Boneless. Ivar was not defined by physical strength, which rumor suggested he barely possessed, but by a serpentine, chilling intelligence that saw weakness where others only saw defense. He was the strategist who understood logistics, fortification, and political manipulation better than any unsuspecting Saxon king.
They whispered that his legs were useless, a detail that only magnified his demonic power, suggesting he was sustained by pure, distilled malice and the unquenchable thirst for retribution.
His arrival was the opening move in a massive, high-stakes chess game played with the lives of nations, a game designed explicitly to avenge the legendary, mythical death of his father, the great Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether Ragnar was truly cast into a pit of vipers by King Aelle of Northumbria is a matter for the skalds in the sagas, but the belief in that betrayal, the psychological weight of that oath of vengeance, fueled the fire that would soon burn half of England to cinders. East Anglia was the first kingdom to fall, not in a great decisive battle, but simply under the sheer, oppressive weight of occupation. King Edmund, paralyzed by the impossible scale of the Viking invasion, quickly bought a desperate temporary peace with a massive tribute of silver, hoping this great army would move on, or maybe just dissolve into the British landscape. This was a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. The Vikings accepted the gold not as payment to leave, but as financing for their extended, permanent stay. They used East Anglia as their logistical staging ground, resting, re-equipping, stockpiling supplies, and, most terrifyingly, gathering perfect intelligence on the fractured kingdoms to the north and west. The gold was not a shield. It was a promissory note for total destruction, signed in the blood of the innocent and guaranteed by the cowardice of the king.
The great army's ultimate strategic target was Northumbria, specifically the ancient Roman fortress city of Eoferwick, which the Saxons called York. This kingdom was already fatally weakened by generations of petty internal feuding and dynastic wars, a carcass ripe for the picking. While two rival claimants, Osbert and the hated Ella, fought a desperate, pointless civil war for the Northumbrian crown, the true enemy was already knocking down the gates, exploiting the exact moment of division.
Ivar didn't need to risk his forces fighting two unified kings. He just needed to wait for them to distract each other long enough for his professional, terrifying forces to execute a perfect surgical siege.
The disciplined Viking shield wall, perfected over centuries of raiding and professional warfare, tore through the disorganized Saxon lines like wet paper. Both kings were captured in the ensuing rout, but only one mattered to Ivar the Boneless, King Ella, the alleged murderer of his father.